Item: SCP-721. Object Class: Safe. Special Containment Procedures. Instances of SCP-721 are to be contained in one of 3 designated lockers at Site-19's low-priority item storage facility, depending on whether they are classified as SCP-721-1, -2, or -3. Each instance must be sealed in a plastic bag with a label that clearly identifies their designation. Upon recovery, all instances of SCP-721 are to be subject to testing with Class D personnel to determine whether they are instances of SCP-721-1, -2, or -3, provided this information is not available from other sources. They are then to be contained according to the procedures outlined in this document. At time of writing, all 6 contained instances of SCP-721-1 are used to monitor and aid in the containment of Sapient Keter class SCP items. Any further instances of SCP-721-1 that are contained may be assigned to similar projects at the discretion of O5-8. Contact Site Director Cassidy for further information. Testing of SCP-721-2 requires permission from Dr. Bright. The use of SCP-721-3 to terminate any person requires approval from no less than 3 personnel with relevant Level 4 clearance or higher. Any subject known to have activated an instance of SCP-721-3 is to be euthanized if possible, then disposed of in the nearest suitable furnace. Description: each instance of SCP-721 is a steel cylinder painted black measuring 7 cm in diameter and 2 cm in height. One side is covered by a steel mesh, and the other by a weak magnet labeled with the factory. Testing does not indicate that the material itself has any anomalous properties. Instances of SCP-721 can be further categorized as SCP-721-1, SCP-721-2, or SCP-721-3 depending on their effects. At time of writing, the Foundation controls 6 instances of SCP-721-1, 8 instances of SCP-721-2, and 2 instances of SCP-721-3. There is no known means of distinguishing between instances of SCP-721 apart from activating its anomalous properties by placing at least 0.2 ml of blood from a sapient organism on the mesh side. Said organism is referred to as the subject. Upon activation of SCP-721-1, all conscious thoughts of the subject will become audible to those within a 60-meter radius as a whispering in the listener's ear. Additionally, the thoughts of all persons within this range will be audible to the subject in the form of whispers emanating from SCP-721-1. While the thoughts of most subjects are too disorganized and incoherent for others to interpret properly, with practice, subjects have shown the ability to use SCP-721 to transmit coherent thoughts to those within its active range. Upon activation of SCP-721-2 and the placement of the object on some form of blank medium, that is paper, audio tape, videotape, or computer with a blank text file open 1, the subject will gain complete mental control over the content of the media in question, and will be capable of transferring any data they can imagine to the media in question.